The next thing we need to do, in order to get to point X, and again, I believe I defined point X to you. Point X basically represents financial independence. And all of us have our own individual point X in our life. And what that point simply is, it's the point where you've accumulated enough assets, okay, where at that point in time, the income that's going to be generated from those assets will be sufficient to maintain your standard of living. By definition, that is what point X is, and that is what financial independence is. So how do we get from point A to point B? Whenever you go onto Google and you look for a map on how to get somewhere, if we type into our navigation system, I want to get to a certain location, well, the very first thing that you have to answer is, well, what's your starting point? You know, where are you right now? Again, with a show of hands, how many of you know what your net worth is? Have you ever added up all of your assets minus all your liabilities and determined what your net worth is? Anybody in the room know what it is? I'm not going to ask you to disclose it to everybody. I just want to know. Does anybody know what their financial net worth currently is? Okay, so you've taken the time to actually calculate that. Critically important. Why? Because without knowing what you look like financially, right, it's impossible to get to point X because you have to have that starting point. When you bring a patient into your office, you're not going to start pulling teeth and filling cavities unless you do some sort of x-ray, right? You have to really figure out where is this patient, what's the starting point, and then you determine what the treatment is so that ultimately they're going to have a great set of teeth, right? That's the goal. It's no different when it comes to financial planning. So you absolutely must determine your net worth. Well, what's involved with determining your net worth? You list out all of your assets. Assets are anything that you own that has value. Things like your car, your home, your IRA account, etc. Then you list out your liabilities. My student loans, my car loan, my mortgage. One minus the other equals your net worth. Okay? And that's the key number that we need to accumulate. It's also very important to understand the difference between investment assets and personal use assets. Now, what is a personal use asset? Those are the assets that we accumulate during our lifetime that really measures our standard of living. So, for example, I could probably live in a $300,000 house in a nice neighborhood, or I could buy a $2 million home in the nicest neighborhood, you know, in California. The question is that a wise choice? Living in that $2 million house instead of the $300,000 house is increasing your standard of living, but at what cost? So it's important to understand that personal use assets, that's what the poor and middle class thrive for, because it makes them feel good to own that big house, the fancy car. The trick here is not accumulating personal use assets. It's accumulating investment assets, assets that are not going to cost you money to maintain them, but assets that are going to generate additional income. So things like funding your IRA accounts, putting money aside in college savings program, just implementing a brokerage account and adding funds to that with the understanding that the reason that money's there is because one day I want to be able, again, to put my head on the pillow and I want to rest and wake up in the morning and not have a worry, at least not about my finances. So preparing that statement of financial position is your starting point. The other important statement you need to prepare is a statement of cash flow. Now, what exactly is that? Well, that's a statement that's going to show all the money coming in and all the money going out. Why is that important? Very simply, if you're bringing in $110,000 as your income this year and you're doing pretty well, that's not so bad. But guess what? When you analyze how you've been spending your money, if you're spending $120,000, what do you think we need to do? We need to change our habits a little bit. We need to change our standard of living. Why? Simply because if you're spending $10,000 more than you're bringing in every year, by definition, you're not going to ever get to point X. All you're doing is adding debt. And so many people across the country are totally loaded up with all sorts of debt. So the trick here is accumulating investment assets that are eventually going to generate income for you and focus more on those type of assets on your balance sheet and not personal use assets.